Okay, well, I have a story for you guys for my science class today. It's April 6th, Monday Science, and this is my second time to teach this science because Miss Gilbert forgot to push record. So I taught your whole lesson only to look up at the camera and see that it was never on. So if you're frustrated today, take a deep breath and just start again. That's all you can do, and I'm learning that's all I can do today. So at least it's a really good lesson, and I love science, so if I have to reteach one, I'm glad this is the one I get to do. So today in science, we're going to start talking about sea urchins, which is on page 178 in your book. And it says, have you ever seen a spiky ball called a sea urchin? This little animal resembles a pincushion with red, purple, green, and other color pins branching out in many different directions. Unlike the animals we have discussed so far, excuse me, sea urchins have no arms. They are, however, completely covered in spines. So the spines are not arms on the sea urchin. If you look at the little picture on page 178, that little girl has a sea urchin in her hand. The sea urchin's spines protect it from being eaten by most creatures. Who wants a mouthful of needles? But there are some sea animals that actively hunt for sea urchins. The sea otter is one example. The sea otter cracks open the sea urchin with a rock and eats the insides. You may wonder what is so tasty inside this sea urchin. Well, often there are millions of urchin eggs inside an urchin. And actually in Japan, people harvest these eggs and sell them for a great deal of money. They are served much like caviar. Under the spines of the sea urchin, you will find a little rounded body. When a sea urchin dies, its spines fall off and you find this shell. You can see a picture of it on page 179. And although it's okay to call it a shell, the actual scientific word is called a test. So you'll see the little boy holding a sea urchin test. You will often find sea urchins living in close community with other sea urchins. They tend to gather in groups. In tropical waters, the sea urchins have very sharp, needle-like spines that are painful on which to step. In cooler waters, the spines are shorter and not as sharp. A sea urchin has tube feet, which it uses to move about slowly. The suction cup grips the rocks to the sea urchin, and so the sea urchin can pull itself along them. Unlike sea stars, these tube feet are found in rows in the span from top to the bottom of the body. And as is the case with most echinoderms, its tube feet help the sea urchin find and taste algae or debris, which it then scrapes off the rocks with its 5 teeth. Do you only have 5 teeth? These 5 special teeth are arranged in a system that scientists call Aristotle's lantern. Some sea urchins can actually use their Aristotle's lantern to bore holes in rocks. They typically bore these holes so that they have a place to hide. So their special teeth are called Aristotle's lantern. Isn't that an interesting name? While most sea urchins use their tube feet to move about, there are actually some species that can walk on their spines, using them a lot like stilts. And if you see in the picture, it says the small stringy strands coming from the sea urchin are its tube feet. And you can see it's pointed to those tube feet. Most sea urchins are harmless to touch. If you are able to pry a sea urchin loose from a rock, you will enjoy holding it and studying its tube feet, Aristotle's lantern, and its many spines. However, one sea urchin, the hat pin urchin, has extremely long spines with serrated tips. Now, if you use a serrated knife in your kitchen, it's the one that it's straight on the back, has the point, and then it does this, right? So that's what serrated means. And this particular one, the hat pin urchin, has these serrated tips, and when touched, it will insert it into the skin and snap off. Eek! The spine then releases poison. This venom is not fatal, that means it won't kill you, but it is very painful and it feels like a really bad bee sting. You may want to avoid this particular type of sea urchin. God designed some sea urchins to camouflage themselves by holding on to seagrass or ocean debris with their tube feet and carrying it around on their backs. Some even carry live, soft corals or anemones for camouflage. They do this to keep from being eaten by other animals. And the next animal that we're going to talk about is the sand dollar, and I think everyone loves the sand dollar. And you'll see a picture there of the sand dollar on page 180. Another kind of echinoderm is the sand dollar. It is like a flattened sea urchin with tiny spines that remind you of the stubble on the face of an unshaven man. The sand dollars you find on the beach are usually not living sand dollars, but are the shells, once again, they're more properly called test, of the dead sand dollar. If you were to find a living sand dollar, you would notice tiny hairs covering its entire body. These are its spines. They are softer and much shorter than those of the sea urchin. So if you look at page 180, that living sand dollar looks quite different from the test of a sand dollar that's died. Okay? Because it has those tiny little spines that you can see. And they're much softer and not nearly as pokey as the sea urchin. Like sea stars, sand dollars have tube feet, but they are not used to move around. They are just used to breathe. The sand dollar's tube feet actually stick out the top of the sand dollar. If you look at a sand dollar test, you will typically see a pattern that looks like the petals of a flower. That pattern is made up of many tiny holes, and it is through those holes that the sand dollar's tube feet extend when it's alive. A sand dollar actually uses its tiny spines to move around. It also uses them to dig into the sand. It often does this so that it can bury itself. Sometimes a sand dollar will only partially bury itself in the sand, and it ends up poking up from the sand, standing on its side. And you'll see that picture of this test. This flower shape on this sand dollar test shows you where the tube feet stuck out. You can see the little tiny holes where the tube feet came out. Okay, on to page 181. On the underside of a sand dollar, you will see a star pattern radiating out from the center where its mouth is located. This star pattern is composed of grooves that are called food grooves. Sand dollars filter sand and water, catching plankton and debris on their spines. Then, with the help of the tiny hairs called cilia, the spines move the food into a food groove, and then the food travels down the food groove to the mouth. Okay, so here's its little food grooves. Okay, so these will catch the food, then it'll move it on tiny hairs into the food groove, and then it travels along the food groove into the mouth. These, I'm going to go ahead and label this one food groove. Okay. Living sand dollars are typically dark in color, such as brown or purple. Their darker color allows them to stay camouflaged, easily hiding in the sand or mud on the seafloor. This makes living sand dollars hard to find, but someone with a keen eye can usually see a little speck of brown pecking out from underneath the sand in a shallow pool of water on the beach. The sand dollars you have seen were probably a pretty white color because, as I mentioned, the ones we usually find aren't living, but are actually just the test of dead sand dollars. When a sand dollar dies, it loses its bristles and tube feet. Exposure to the sun tends to bleach it, producing a nice white sand dollar test. How did the sand dollar get its name? Well, many years ago, there was no paper money. All money was in the form of coins. A dollar was usually a very large silver coin. The test of sand dollars reminded people of these large coins, so people started calling them sand dollars. To this day, some children are told that sand dollars are the money that mermaids use. Okay, so next we're going to learn about sea cucumbers. You can see a picture of a sea cucumber there on page 181. So, the last echinoderm I want to discuss doesn't look much like an echinoderm. It looks much more like a cucumber that has small bumps or spines on it. I am talking about the sea cucumber. No, this is not a fruit or a plant that grows in the sea. It is an animal. And that animal has many of the characteristics of an echinoderm. Sea cucumbers are sausage-shaped, benthic animals that can be found in the shallowest of waters as well as the deepest parts of the ocean. They each have 5 rows of tube feet that stretch the length of the body, and they use those tube feet to slowly move around the ocean floor. So we think it's like this, and then it has 5 of these rows with tube feet. Okay, and then it would go all the way around their different rows. The mouth is on one end of the sea cucumber, and it's usually surrounded by tentacles. So here's the mouth, and then it's going to have some tentacles coming off. Let's do mouth. Okay. Oh, Miss Gilbert can't spell today either. Mouth. There we go. Okay. Many cucumbers eat sand. Yes, sand. The sand enters the mouth, and as it moves through the sea cucumber system, food particles are absorbed by the body and digested. Anything that isn't food is eliminated out the other end of the sea cucumber, which is called the anus. Goes in one end and out the other. Instead of eating sand, other sea cucumbers use their tentacles to filter food out of the water. Then they move the food to the mouth where it can be eaten. If a sea cucumber filters water in this way, its tentacles are usually longer and more branched than the tentacles of a sea cucumber that eats sand. One of the most fascinating things that sea cucumbers do is spill their guts. No, they don't tell you about all of their problems. When a sea cucumber spills its guts, it literally spills its guts out. When threatened by a possible predator, the sea cucumber tosses out long, sticky threads that are actually made up of its own internal organs. These sticky threads can glue a predator's gills or their throat shut. This will eventually kill the animal. It certainly gives the predator something else to worry about instead of eating a sea cucumber. That's a nice form of defense, isn't it? Of course, these body parts are soon regenerated, so there's no long-term damage to the sea cucumber. Sea cucumbers come in a variety of colors and can be as small as your fingernail or several feet long. You may find one if you frequent tide pools or reefs, but don't be surprised if you mistake it for a fruit. Okay, and if you look on page 182, you can see the mouth. That's the mouth of a sea cucumber sticking out there with all the branches coming out. So with that, it ends our lesson, but I'd like to finish with the legend of the sand dollar. And if you look on page 183, you can look at that picture right there while I read it. There's a pretty little legend that I would like to tell of the birth and death of Jesus found